The morning Rowan nearly drowned. There were 47 people standing on that dock, and not one of them moved. It was the kind of Saturday that draws crowds to the Halifax waterfront. Late September, the air still holding the last warmth of summer, the kind of day that makes people forget they live somewhere that will be buried in snow in 6 weeks. The farmer's market was running along Lower Water Street, the usual line snaking out of the coffee cart, couples pushing strollers, retirees with canvas bags. The old pier had been dressed up for the Meridian Group's annual fundraiser. White linen tablecloths, a string quartet, servers in pressed black moving between guests with champagne flutes. It was the sort of event that costs $3,000 a plate and raises money for children's hospitals, which meant the people attending it had the luxury of feeling both wealthy and virtuous at the same time. Bram Calloway had been working since 6 that morning. He wasn't part of the fundraiser. He worked for the Harbour Authority, routine maintenance, checking the integrity of the dock fenders, clearing kelp from the mooring posts before the weekend traffic picked up. He'd parked his truck at the far end of the pier, the one with the cracked taillight he kept meaning to fix, and spent the first 3 hours of his shift doing the kind of work nobody notices until it stops being done. His hands were cold. His thermos was empty. He was thinking about whether his daughter had remembered to take her inhaler to her grandmother's when he heard the splash. Not a dramatic splash. That's what people always get wrong about these things. It wasn't a scream or a crash. It was a small sound, the particular sound of something that shouldn't be in the water going into it, and then a child's voice saying something that wasn't quite a word. Bram was moving before he'd made a decision to move. The girl was maybe 4 years old, and she'd gone in between the dock and a moored sailboat, which was the worst possible place. The gap was narrow, the hull was close, and the water in Halifax Harbour in late September is 9 degrees Celsius. He'd done the marine safety course twice through the Harbour Authority. He knew exactly what 9 degrees meant. He didn't stop to take off his boots. He went in over the side, grabbed the back of her jacket before she'd gone under a second time, got his arm under her, and got her back to the surface. Someone had finally thought to throw a life ring. It landed 3 feet to his left, and he got her onto it and pushed toward the nearest ladder. There was shouting above him by then. Several pairs of hands reached down. He passed her up and somebody took her, and that was the part he didn't see because he was busy climbing the ladder himself, and the rungs were slippery, and the whole thing was considerably less cinematic than it sounds in retrospect. He pulled himself onto the dock, crouched there, dripping, catching his breath. The crowd had formed the way crowds always do. A ring, too close, full of people asking questions nobody was answering. He could see the girl now, wrapped in someone's catering jacket, crying steadily in the way children cry when they're scared but not hurt. Her color was okay, her airway was clear. She was 4 years old and she was going to be fine. Bram sat back on his heels and realized his boots were completely saturated and he had 6 more hours on his shift. Here, someone was crouching beside him. A woman about his age, with blonde hair that was escaping from whatever it had been pinned into, probably had been very neat 20 minutes ago. She was holding out a dry cloth napkin from the catering table, the expensive kind with the hem stitching, and her expression was the opposite of the crowd's. She wasn't excited, she wasn't performing concern. She was just looking at him the way a person looks at another person when they want to make sure they're actually okay. He took the napkin. "Thanks, are you hurt?" "No." He looked down at himself. Harbour water. His good jacket. Well, his work jacket, which was the only jacket he owned. Just wet. You went in fast. She was in a bad spot. The woman sat back slightly, studying him. She had the kind of posture that came from years of being the person in the room who people waited on, but she didn't seem aware of it. That's an understatement. She was in between the hull and the dock. "You saw? I was right here." She glanced toward the girl, who was now being held by a woman who was very likely her mother, given the way she was holding her. The mother was crying harder than the child. "We were all right here." Something moved across her face, not guilt exactly, something more complicated than that. Bram didn't say anything. He'd been in enough situations to know that when people said "we were all right here," they usually meant I should have moved. There was no point in agreeing with them out loud. "Calloway," someone called from behind him, his supervisor, Doug, making his way through the thinning crowd. "You all right?" "Jesus, fine." He stood up, his socks made a sound. "I'm going to need to get a dry pair of boots from the truck." Doug looked at him the way men look at other men when they want to acknowledge something without making it a whole thing. He clapped him once on the shoulder and said, "Take your time." When Bram turned back, the woman was still there. That surprised him. He'd expected her to have drifted back to the fundraiser, back to Thai champagne and the string quartet and the $3,000 plates. The event was still running. He could hear the music. But she was still crouching there on the dock, one hand resting on her knee, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You work here?" she asked. "Harbour Authority. Maintenance." She nodded like that explained something. Then, "I'm Catherine Aldrich." He'd heard the name. You heard it in Halifax if you paid any attention to business news, which he didn't particularly, but the Meridian Group was hard to miss. They'd redeveloped half the waterfront over the last decade. The fundraiser behind him had Meridian's name on the tent. "Bram Calloway," he said. She shook his hand. Her grip was direct, no performance in it. "You're soaking wet," she said. "And you're going back to work, 4 more hours on shift, in wet boots." 6 months ago, I stepped in a snowmelt puddle in February and worked a whole Saturday in wet boots. This is only marginally worse. Something shifted in her expression. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something closer to recognition, the look of someone who finds a specific kind of dry humor funnier than they expected to. "I should go," he said. "Yes," she agreed. She didn't move. "That little girl's name is Emma, by the way. I spoke to her mother. She's 4. She was chasing a bird." She paused. "Her mother wanted me to tell you. She couldn't get through the crowd to reach you directly. She wanted me to tell you." Bram nodded. He looked out at the water for a moment, and then back at Catherine Aldrich, who was the CEO of a company with half the waterfront to its name, and who was crouching on a dock in what was probably a very expensive dress, telling him a 4-year-old had been chasing a bird. "Tell her she's welcome," he said. He walked back to his truck. He didn't look back. That wasn't modesty. It just didn't occur to him to. The Meridian Group occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower on Barrington Street, and Catherine Aldrich had occupied the corner office on the 32nd floor for 9 years. She'd taken over from her predecessor at 34, which had generated a certain amount of press at the time. A lot of photographs, a profile in Atlantic Business magazine, the word youngest appearing more times than she'd have chosen. By now the press had moved on to other things and she'd moved on to the work, which suited her better anyway. She had 2 standing rules about the office. First, no one scheduled meetings before 8 in the morning because she came in at 6:30 and those 90 minutes were hers. Second, she didn't bring personal problems through the glass doors because 20 people reported to her directly and another 140 indirectly, and they needed her to be clear-headed. She broke the second rule the Monday after the waterfront fundraiser. Not visibly, she ran the 9 o'clock team meeting the same way she always ran it. Prepared, efficient, ending 12 minutes early. She reviewed the Dartmouth development contracts before lunch. She took a call from their legal team in Toronto and made 3 decisions that saved the company approximately $200,000 in unnecessary consultation fees. From the outside, the day looked like every other day. But she kept thinking about the dock, not the girl in the water, though she thought about that too, had replayed it with a clarity that was uncomfortable. The 2-second gap between the splash and her own frozen stillness, while a maintenance worker she'd never seen before vaulted over the side without hesitating. She thought about that gap. She'd stood at the edge of the dock with 46 other people, and not one of them had moved, including her, and she was not someone who stood still when things needed doing. She told herself it had been too fast, that there hadn't been time to react. She mostly believed it. But she also kept thinking about Bram Calloway standing there in a saturated jacket, water running off him, telling her he'd done it before in worse conditions. February, a snowmelt puddle in the tone of someone describing a slightly inconvenient Tuesday. She kept thinking about the way he'd said tell her she's welcome. Not tell her it was nothing. Not tell her I was just doing my job. Just, she's welcome. Like the matter was simple. Like he'd simply done what needed to be done and now it was done and he had 4 more hours on shift. She'd looked him up. That was the part she didn't examine too carefully, the impulse to look him up, the speed with which she'd done it. The Harbour Authority's staff directory wasn't public, but she knew the harbour master, a man named Bouchard, who owed her a courtesy call anyway. She'd kept it brief. Just, the man on shift Saturday maintenance, Calloway. Bouchard's given her what he had. 15 years with the authority. Lid technician, reliable as weather equipment. Widower. daughter age 6. Widower. She'd sat with that word for a moment before closing her email. She told herself she was following up on behalf of the Meridian Group. It was reasonable. The incident had happened at a Meridian event. There might be some goodwill worth extending. A letter, something official, a gesture. She had her assistant draft a note to the Harbour Authority, thanking their staff for their response. It was a perfectly sensible thing to do. It had nothing to do with the fact that she hadn't been able to stop thinking about him since Saturday. Bram's daughter was named Pip. Her actual name was Philippa Calloway, which was on her school registration and her health card and nowhere else, because she had decided at age 3 that she preferred Pip, and that was that. She was 6 now, small for her age, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and she had recently developed an intense interest in weather systems that Bram was doing his best to keep up with. "Dad," she said on Wednesday evening, from her position on the kitchen counter where she was not supposed to be sitting but usually ended up anyway, "did you know that when warm air and cold air collide it makes thunder? Because the air expands so fast." "I did know that, actually." He handed her a carrot stick. "Get down from there, I'm helping, you're supervising, same thing." She accepted the carrot stick but didn't get down. She watched him chop onions with the focused attention she brought to most things. "Mrs. Garreau said I talked too much about weather in sharing circle." "Did she?" "I was just being informative. There's a time and a place for being informative." Pip considered this. What if the time is always and the place is everywhere? Bram put down the knife and looked at his daughter. She looked back at him with her mother's eyes and the specific expression that meant she already knew she was funny but was waiting to see if he'd catch it. He caught it. "Get down from the counter, Pip." She got down from the counter, still smiling. This was their life. It was not what he'd planned, because nobody plans the particular shape their life takes when they're 31, and their wife gets a diagnosis that moves faster than anyone expected. And you spend the next 2 years learning things you didn't want to learn, and then you are 33, and you have a 3-year-old and a house in Dartmouth and a job you're good at, and you put one foot in front of the other, because what else is there? He was 39 now. Pip was 6. He was, by most available measures, doing fine. He was also, by most available measures, not thinking about Catherine Aldrich, except that he was. He'd looked her up too. That was the thing he hadn't admitted to himself until about Thursday morning, standing in the shower. He'd looked her up the way people look things up when they tell themselves they're just being curious. A Wikipedia article, a couple of news profiles, a photograph from some industry conference where she was on a panel and looking at whoever was speaking with an expression of polite but absolute focus. He'd read about the Meridian Group and the waterfront redevelopment and the Children's Hospital fundraiser that ran annually, the one he'd been working alongside on Saturday. He didn't know why he was doing this. He was a Harbour Authority maintenance tech with wet boots and a 6-year-old who knew too much about thunder. Catherine Aldrich ran a company worth more than he'd earn in a lifetime. He put it out of his mind. He was very good at putting things out of his mind. Then on Friday morning, a letter arrived at the Harbour Authority offices addressed to the maintenance department, specifically to him, which was unusual enough that Doug personally walked it down to where Bram was doing the weekly equipment check on the patrol boat. "Fan mail," Doug said, and handed it over. It was on Meridian Group letterhead. It was professionally written, gracious, formal, the appropriate language for an official letter of thanks. It acknowledged the incident Saturday in neutral terms and expressed the organization's appreciation for the Harbour Authority staff's quick response. And at the bottom, in handwriting that was somewhat less formal than the typed body of the letter, "If you'd like a coffee sometime, I know a place on Barrington that doesn't make you pay $3,000 for it." K. Aldrich Bram read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket and went back to the equipment check, and Doug, who had been watching from a careful distance, said nothing at all. The coffee place on Barrington turned out to be a small Portuguese bakery 2 blocks from the Meridian Tower, the kind of place that had been there for 30 years and had absolutely no intention of rebranding, with mismatched chairs and pastéis de nata in a case by the register and coffee that was genuinely excellent. Catherine was already there when he arrived. She was in what he recognized as the particular version of casual that people wear when they're in a high-visibility job and they want a signal that this is not a work meeting. No blazer, dark jeans, a wool sweater, She had her hands around a coffee cup and she was reading something on her phone, which she put away when he walked in, with the directness of someone who considered it rude to keep looking at a screen when a person arrived. "You found it," she said. "I've been here before." He sat down. "I do maintenance on the building 3 doors down." That surprised her, he could tell. "The Pembridge? Water damage in the basement parking level 6 weeks ago." He looked around the bakery. "My crew foreman introduced me to this place." A brief silence. The server appeared and he ordered a coffee. "I almost didn't come," Catherine said. He looked at her. "I wasn't sure it was appropriate." She said it evenly, like someone who'd thought it through and decided honesty was more efficient than pretense. "I'm on the board of the Harbour Authority. Not directly, through the Waterfront Development Committee. It puts me in a complicated position relative to the staff. That's a straightforward thing to say. I try to be straightforward." Noted. His coffee arrived. He picked it up. "You could have just sent the official letter." "I did send the official letter. You know what I mean." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "I do." A pause. "You didn't hesitate." "Not for a second." "I've been thinking about that since Saturday." "You think too much about it, maybe." She was in between the hull and the dock, he said. "That's a bad position in cold water. You don't think about it, you just move. 46 people didn't." He set his cup down. He looked at her steadily, the same way he'd looked at her on the dock, that level look that didn't perform anything. "You know why I know it was 46? She waited. "Because I counted the letter. You wrote 47 people on that dock. I was one of them. That means 46 didn't move." He picked up his cup again. "You counted too." Something shifted in her expression. Not embarrassment. She wasn't the embarrassing type. It was something closer to being seen when you hadn't expected to be. "I did," she said quietly. "You were going to." "I just got there first. You don't know that." "No," he agreed. "I don't." He looked out the window at Barrington Street. "But I think you know it." They sat with that for a moment. The bakery was warm and smelled like coffee and pastry, and it was a Thursday afternoon and neither of them, technically, should have had time for this. "My daughter's name is Pip," he said, not entirely sure why he said it. "She's 6. She told me last night that thunder happens because warm and cold air collide and the air expands fast." Catherine blinked. Then the thing that wasn't quite a smile moved across her face again. "Is she right?" "Completely. How old were you when you knew something like that?" 25, probably. "And only because I was doing a marine safety certification." He set his cup down. "She's going to know everything by the time she's 9 and the rest of us will just have to keep up." "She sounds remarkable. She's a lot." He said it the way people say things that are hard to put into words, not with sentimentality, just with the precise weight of it. "She's a lot, and she's worth every bit of it." Catherine Aldrich was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father raised me and my brother alone after my mother left. I was 8. I know what that looks like from the outside." She met his eyes. "I didn't know what it looked like from the inside until right now." Bram didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They stayed another 40 minutes. The conversation moved to other things. The waterfront development. A disagreement they had about the timeline of a particular pier restoration that got unexpectedly animated, and the server brought them each another coffee without being asked. And the afternoon light came through the window in the particular way it does in Halifax in October, slanted and golden and already thinking about leaving. When they walked out onto Barrington Street, the temperature had dropped. "The Pembridge is that way," she said, nodding. 3 blocks. A pause. She pulled her coat around her. "Same time next week?" she said, like it was simple, like she'd decided. He looked at her. He thought about Pip on the kitchen counter explaining thunder. He thought about the 9 degrees of harbor water and the letter in his shirt pocket and the 46 people who'd stood on the dock. "Yeah," he said, "same time." The weeks moved the way weeks move in Halifax in autumn, quickly, sideways, full of weather. They had coffee the next Thursday, and the one after that. He found out she ran 6 kilometers every morning before the office, hated overhead fluorescence, and had a younger brother in Vancouver who called her every Sunday and talked too long. She found out he built things in his garage on weekends, not for any reason, just because he liked it, furniture mostly, a set of shelves he was making for Pip's room. She found out he read history, the kind with long footnotes. He found out she could argue about municipal zoning regulations with a passion that was, objectively, out of proportion to the subject, and that this was somehow completely unsurprising. She met Pip by accident in week 4. Bram had picked her up from his mother's place and stopped into the bakery for takeaway pastries, and Catherine was there having a working lunch with two of her project managers who'd chosen the bakery specifically because it was not the office. The project managers saw their CEO stand up when the maintenance worker walked in with a small girl in a bright orange rain jacket and exchanged the kind of brief, specific smile that people exchange when they're genuinely glad to see someone, and they asked no questions but later, in the elevator, exchanged a look that contained a great many of them. Pip looked at Catherine with the frank assessment of a 6-year-old. "You have very tall shoes," she said. "I do," Catherine agreed, with the seriousness the observation deserved. "Do they hurt?" "Sometimes." Pip considered this information. "My dad says uncomfortable things are okay sometimes if they're worth it," Bram said. "Pip, that's a good philosophy," Catherine said. She looked up at Bram with an expression that he was starting to recognize, the one she used when something landed differently than expected, when she'd been caught off guard by something she found more interesting than she'd anticipated. He said, "We'll let you get back to your lunch." "Of course." She stood straight. She looked at him for a moment. "Thursday?" "Thursday," he said. Pip waited until they were outside. Then, "Who's that?" "Someone I know." "She looks at you like Mrs. Garreau looks at the new reading series she got for the class, like she's figured something out." Bram held the bakery door open and said nothing. "Dad, eat your pastry, Pip." The Meridian Group's board met in December, which meant Catherine spent November in a state of sustained low-level preparation that everyone around her recognized and nobody commented on. She reviewed every project, every contract, every budget variance. She worked late. She answered emails at 6 in the morning. She was, by any external measure, focused entirely on the company. She still made Thursday coffee. She didn't analyze that too carefully. She'd learned over 9 years of running an organization to distinguish between decisions that needed analysis and decisions that were already made. She knew the difference between her board brain and her actual brain, and her actual brain had decided about Bram Calloway sometime around week 2, when he'd told her, in the same tone he used to describe Harbour maintenance, that he'd taught himself to cook after his wife died because Pip needed real food and he figured he might as well get good at it. I figured I might as well get good at it. It was such a Bram Calloway way to talk about grief. Not around it, not through it, just there is a thing that needs doing, so you do it, and while you're doing it you might as well do it properly. She thought about that sentence more than she'd have admitted to anyone. She was not accustomed to admitting things. She was accustomed to deciding things. She was deciding something now. The board dinner was the first Friday of December, formal. The private room at a restaurant downtown, the 12 board members and a handful of senior staff. She gave the annual address which she'd prepared and memorized and delivered with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she was communicating and to whom. The evening was, by all accounts, a success. She left at 9:30, which was earlier than expected, and walked the 4 blocks to the waterfront because the night was clear and cold and she needed to think. The dock was different at night. Quieter, obviously, no crowds. The boats were dark shapes on dark water. The city lights reflected across the harbor in the way they do when it's cold enough for the water to be still. She walked to the edge of the pier, not the spot where it had happened, a different spot further along, and stood there for a while, hands in her coat pockets. She heard footsteps. Then, Catherine. She turned. Bram was there. He was in work clothes. He'd pulled an evening shift, she knew, covering for a colleague, and he had his toolbox with him, and he looked the same way he always looked, which was like someone who'd decided a long time ago not to pretend to be something he wasn't. "I didn't expect," she started. "Night check on the fenders," he said. "Same as every Friday. You know we do a night check." He set the toolbox down. "You walked past my truck." She had in fact walked past his truck. "I wasn't thinking about it, obviously." He came and stood beside her, not too close, the right distance. They looked out at the water. "The board dinner was tonight," he said. "Sis, went well?" "Yes," a pause. The water moved. "I've been thinking," she said, "about." It wasn't quite a question, which was very like him. She looked at him. He was looking at the water, patient, unhurried, the way he was with everything. "About the fact that it's been 11, she said, "and I have had coffee with you 11 times, and I have not once." She stopped. She was not someone who stopped mid-sentence. "I'm not doing this right." He turned then. He looked at her. "What I'm trying to say," she said, is that I am aware that I am the chair of a board that has some regulatory relationship with your employer, and that you are. Another stop. This was not going how she'd planned it, which was unusual because things she planned went how she planned them. I don't want to make this something that it isn't. What is it, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Something I don't want to be careful about, she said, which is not how I usually feel about anything. Bram Calloway was quiet for a moment. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her on the dock, the level look that didn't perform anything and didn't miss anything. He'd looked at her like that on a Saturday in September when he was dripping Harbour water onto the dock, and she'd been crouching beside him with a linen napkin, and neither of them had known yet that this was how it started. "You know what Pip said to me last week?" he said. She waited. She said, "Dad, you seem different when you talk about your bakery friend." He let that sit for a second. "She's 6. She calls you the bakery friend. What did you say?" I said she was right. I am different. He looked at the water, then back at her. I told her you weren't just a bakery friend. Catherine Aldrich stood on the Halifax waterfront in December with her hands in her coat pockets and looked at this man who'd gone into Harbour water without thinking twice, and who taught himself to cook because his daughter needed real food, and who read history with footnotes and built shelves in his garage on weekends, and who had, at some point in the last 11 weeks, become something she didn't have a category for. "What did you call me?" she asked. "I said you were someone who mattered," he said simply. She asked if that was good. I said yes. He looked at her. "Is it?" She took her hands out of her coat pockets. "Yes," she said. "It is." The harbor was quiet. The city lights moved on the water. Somewhere behind them, up on Barrington Street, the board dinner was winding down and the city was carrying on, and none of that was the most important thing happening right now on this dock. Bram Calloway reached out, and she took his hand, and it was that simple, and it was that much. Pip, who would hear the story eventually, would say that her favorite part was the bakery. She'd say it very seriously, with the authority of someone who considered herself a crucial part of the narrative, and she would be right, which was something both of them would agree on, for the rest of a life they hadn't yet imagined but were finally beginning to.